Hi, I'm author Leslie Montgomery, and welcome to Truth and Grace. Sex is a gift from God. Well, how many times have you heard that over the years? And now, let's be honest. How many of you are rolling your eyes? In today's program, we're going to get down and dirty about the lies permeated in the evangelical church regarding the marital bed. Here's a spoiler alert. What we've been taught isn't biblical and hasn't worked. Well, at least not for us women. Author Sheila Wray Gregoire, her beautiful daughter, Rebecca Gregoire Lindenback, and Joanna Sawatsky surveyed more than 20,000 Christian women about their sex lives, marriages, and beliefs about sex and marriage, and the women who participated held little back in their answers. Sheila, Rebecca, and Joanna never imagined what they'd uncover. The most popular Christian resources and teachings on bettering sex and marriages were doing more harm than good. In their new research-based book, The Great Sex Rescue, The Lies You've Been Taught and How to Recover What God Intended, these bold, godly women take on this sensitive issue with truth in one hand and your liberation from bondage in the other. I'm both honored and blessed to have with us today the authors, Sheila, Rebecca, and Joanna. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you, Leslie. It's great to be here.
Really blessed to have you guys here. And let me just put a disclaimer out for my listeners. Obviously, the book is called The Great Sex Rescue. So we are going to be talking about sex and everything pertaining to that. So if you have little ears or even big ears, be aware you may want to just put this interview on pause and listen to it when they're down with their nap or later when you can listen to it on your own. So ladies, I just want to say, I've already said this to the ladies, if you're listening to the interview, this book is a breakthrough book. I could not wait to interview you guys on this book. There are so many myths associated with sex, especially in the church. What got you started on this book?
Well, I've been blogging about sex for years. I blog it to lovehonorandvacuum.com. And in 2012, my book, The Good Girl's Guide to Great Sex, came out. And around that time, my blog kind of switched to all sex all the time. So I was always, my blog traffic went up. Like, who knew that people wanted to talk about sex, right? So, so I'm putting out all this great content, and we're creating like orgasm courses and libido courses and 31 days to great sex, lots of stuff, but everybody still has the same issues. And we started to realize that telling good content isn't enough if there's something wrong with the foundation. Mm-hmm. And about 2 years ago, we started to read some of the best-selling evangelical books to see what they were saying about sex, and alarm bells started to go off. And so we thought we better check to see if what people have been taught about sex is actually hurting them. Because maybe it's not just that we need to give good content, maybe we actually need to address the bad stuff that we've been taught and get rid of it.
And I was really surprised when I read the book, how many bestsellers have been out over the 20, 30 years that you guys mentioned in the book that really were teaching harmful sexual practices. And basically they were teaching that all men want is sex and all women want is basically to snuggle, right? I mean, but that's not what you were hearing from women, right? I mean, women were saying, hey, I want to be pleasured too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that was a really common theme among the books that we looked at. Cause, we didn't just go in and say, what do we think is unhealthy, right? This isn't an opinion piece book. We surveyed 20,000 women, like you said earlier. And what we did is we looked at how is their marriage, how is their sex life, and what do they believe? We didn't even ask, do you think what you believe is healthy or not? We just asked for the objective, do you believe it, yes or no? Mm-hmm. And where did you hear it from? And then what we did was we found which of the teachings that we identified in these books leads to lower orgasm rates, higher rates of sexual pain, lower rates of arousal. And frankly, a lot of it was this mentality that sex is for men and it's something that women give, and does that surprise us at all? When we raise women, we tell them this isn't for you. Boys are going to want to take this. When you're married, you're going to have to give it. You are obligated to have sex with your husband when he wants it. if you don't have sex, he's going to watch porn. If we tell him all these toxic things, which is saying sex isn't for you, sex is something that is either taken from you or is a weapon that you can use to make sure you keep your man pure.
Right.
Like, that is not an empowering sexual message for women.
No. And something else is that sex is, you grow up, I think, in a Christian home that sex is bad, you don't have it. And then you get married and you're supposed to have a good time and have it all the time. And so there's this guilt, shame, I'm supposed to have it, but I felt bad about it my whole life, and how do you get over that? So there's just but I think one of the things that really stood out in the book for me is that sex was given as the answer for everything.
Yeah.
All right. So your husband has a porn addiction, just give him more sex. Your husband's beating you and your kids, just give him more sex. If your husband is cheating on you, just give him more sex. I mean, it doesn't matter what the problem was in the marriage. These bestsellers were telling the women just to provide more sexual. If it was just amazing to me to read you quoting all these books and hearing these people I've actually looked up to and admire admonishing these women to just provide sex, whether it was discomfort to them, whether they were on their period and it was uncomfortable for them, or whether they were tired, or no matter what was going on with her job was to give sex.
Yeah.
Well, and that comes back to that question you were asking about, why did we write this book? Right. And it's when we started looking at these materials and we started listening to these problems that our readers were having after, 5-6 years of reading your blog. Like, they're like, I have all the right ideas, but there's something still holding me back. What we realized is that the whole foundation is faulty, right? Because we know that sex is meant to be great. And not great with an asterisk, right? Like, oh, like this thing you have to do, but don't worry, it can sometimes feel good. Like, no, like it's just something that is good, right? Like, this is a gift that God was given to us. And so if the entire foundation that we have about sex does not mirror that it's something that is intimate, that is passionate, that is fundamentally humanizing for both partners. It's not an entitlement give or take. It's actually something that is life-giving. If our foundation of what sex means is anything other than that, we have steered couples on the wrong course. And so when we hear messages like, you always have to have sex is always the answer to everything that's bad, what does that say about what we think about sex? Because is it life-giving to tell a woman with a porn-addicted husband, it's probably your fault you didn't put out enough?
Right.
Is that life-giving? Is that humanizing to her? No, it's not. And so we must be off track.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to really the definition of sex.
Yeah.
Because the definition of sex that is given in most of these books, I would sum it up with what Emerson Eggert said in Love and Respect. Like, a husband needs physical release through sexual intimacy. And so the definition of sex is physical release. And in Every Man's Battle, it says a man's eyes are harder to control. They're like heat-seeking missiles. And so do the right thing, give him release. And it's that idea that sex is about a man's release. And we read this in multiple books. That is not how the Bible describes sex. I remember I was 13 years old and I'm sitting in a pew in junior high with all of my friends on either side of me. And the pastor opens to Genesis 4, verse 1, and he reads, and Adam knew his wife Eve and they conceived a son. And of course, our whole pew starts shaking because we're all laughing because God is embarrassed of using the real word or something. And my mother's giving me that look like, you better stop it, which causes you to laugh even harder. But what I realized as I got older is that the Hebrew word there for to know is the same word that David uses in the Psalms when he says, search me and know me, O God. And I think God deliberately used that word to tell us that sex is not just release. Sex is this deep and intimate knowing. And that means that two people matter, because you can't know somebody if someone's needs are being erased. You can only know someone if both people are being considered and both people are valuable. And so the biblical model is this intimate sex which certainly is pleasurable, as we see from Song of Solomon, and which also is completely and utterly mutual, as we see from 1 Corinthians 7. And yet the way that it is talked about in our books is so much about male entitlement and female obligation. And seriously, do they really think that's going to make women hot? Like, oh, baby, come at me because I owe you. Like, no, that's the worst message in the world.
Right. And you did hear from some men who said, hey, I need more than an orgasm. There were men who you quote in the book who said, yeah, I really want that spiritual connection. I want that emotional connection. Just having an orgasm is not all that I want.
Yeah. And I don't think guys like this either. Sorry, go ahead, Joanna.
So we just actually completed a survey of men, and we asked men if they are satisfied with how frequently their wife orgasms. And then we asked them about how their wife is satisfied with how frequently she climaxes. And when we compared the men's appraisal with their wives, actually the guys are more likely to be dissatisfied. And that actually is true even if we compare the men in the men's survey to the women in the women's survey. So guys care about how their wives are doing in the bedroom. And we often found that husbands actually don't know what their wives have internalized. Oftentimes what we found in our focus groups was that if a wife would deconstruct these beliefs, she'd say, oh, honey, I think you always need sex. And he'll say, oh, no, I don't. That's not true. And that was their breakthrough when they realized what she'd been internalizing. And then were able to actually find out who her husband really is. I think that the real tragedy of these teachings is that they push couples apart because they say to wives, you can't trust your husbands. And we found in all of the statistics that we ran that if you tell women you can't trust your husband, they'll trust their husbands less, which is perfectly reasonable.
That really brought me to the 72-hour. Mention that because there's probably a lot of people who are hung up on that.
Okay, yeah, the 72-hour rule. You see it throughout books. And so what I did was we chose the 10 best-selling marriage books. We looked on Amazon one day when we were just starting this project. We found the 10 best-selling marriage books that weren't new releases. So they were, had been bestsellers for a while. And then we found these 6 iconic sex books. And I read through all of them, made copious notes, and I found that in a lot of them, they talked about this 72-hour rule, like Kevin Lehman in Sheet Music. If you're not willing to have sex every 48 to 72 hours, don't get married. Every Man's Battle talked about how you have to have sex every 72 hours, even during your period. Or you have to at least give him release of some sort. Power of a Praying Wife says it's throughout so many of our books. And I was trying to figure out where this came from. And so Joanna, who's really good at research, she looked on PubMed, and you did. Well, both of you guys did. You scoured the medical journals to find out, do men's testicles become more testy? At hour 73, and there was nothing.
No. We couldn't find any medical evidence that men feel physical discomfort after going 3 or 4 days without sex,
or that they become more grumpy, because that's what we heard. And so I finally found it. There was a footnote in one of the books because they were all quoting each other, right? And I finally found it that it went back to a book that James Dobson wrote in 1977, but he didn't base it on anything. He just said that men's testicles refill with semen every 72 hours, and so this means that they need release every 72 hours. And so wives, you need to give him release every 72 hours. And we hear this at marriage conferences, on blogs, everywhere, the 72-hour rule is there, but it's not a thing.
The one thing that we did find actually in the research, it's really funny, is that the perception of how frequently men need release is cultural. So if they believe it's a 72-hour rule, they may actually experience that, but it's a cultural thing. So if we change the culture, that will shift men's felt need for sex. So it seems that it's just a self-fulfilling prophecy.
One of the things I was thinking about, I was rereading my notes this morning in preparation for the interview, is what if we flipped the script and we talked about women this way? What if we said to men, it's your responsibility to make sure your wife orgasms every single time she has, you have sex with her. And if you don't, she has a right to cheat on you or look at pornography. I mean,
Yeah.
there would be outrage. There would be absolutely outrage, but there isn't when it comes to men. There's this huge double standard. Don't you think? I mean, there's this double standard with men. If we wrote a book that Steve Arterburn's written, that these other bestsellers have written about women, oh, there would be outrage. Who would we get to publish it?
Yeah. Well, we've set up a strange dynamic in the evangelical world where men's experience is the default, right? We just accept it, right? So men say, I need X, and so we don't question it. We just say, well, then men must need X. And we don't question, but is this healthy? Is this true? Is this helpful for women? We simply accept it. And so what happens is the reason that would never work for women to write is because people don't just accept women's experience in the church. Women's experience is seen as fundamentally less important than men's. And we see that in all of these books, you know, where we're told, even if you feel like all you want to do is push him away and run off, like, you have to have sex anyway. Like there's examples of, it doesn't matter if you're ill, if you're on your period, if you're postpartum. In sheet music, Kevin Lehman still tells women it's your duty as a wife to give your husband release, to help him if he's, and he quotes, climbing the walls during your postpartum period, which I will say is horrifically offensive as a woman who has had a child. And this is the thing though, is we're in a culture where it is assumed that in a woman's period, during her postpartum, if she's ill, her husband's experience is still more valid than hers. And so it's appropriate to tell her to give her husband a blowjob if she's just had a baby.
Yeah.
And that simply wouldn't happen if we were in a culture that was humanizing both members of the couple.
And we're sorry for being so graphic, but that's actually Kevin Lehman.
That's Kevin Lehman, yeah. Like, and I do want to say, we can be very hesitant to be graphic about what these authors are telling women to do, but I think it's important to put it into real terms so that we can put a face to what is actually being told.
No,
right?
I am known to being blunt. I'm known to being blunt. So you don't have to worry about.
Yeah, I'm more for the listeners. I figured in our conversations you'll be fine.
No, my listeners know me. They know me. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's so much information in this book. It's hard for me to stay on one thing, but you talk a lot about pornography in the book, and how not only does it destroy a marriage, but also about how much it affects a man with erectile dysfunction, with other issues within the marriage. Now we're even seeing 15-year-olds with erectile dysfunction because they're so early on with pornography. But talk about what you guys found with pornography in marriage.
Well, one of the big things is that the blame for porn use is so often put on the wife. And I'm going to let Joanna elaborate on this in a minute with our men's survey results. But like Every Man's Battle, for instance, says that when he's quitting lust and porn, she can be like a merciful vial of methadone for him. And it says this twice, calling her methadone in the book. And I can't think of anything more dehumanizing.
Yeah. In fact, when we were originally talking about lust and porn on the blog, we were trying to come up with a really shocking, graphic, disgusting metaphor. And I literally thought of methadone. It's on our website. You can go see it.
From before we read Every Man's Battle?
Yeah. And methadone was the example that we came up with as a fundamentally dehumanizing and disgusting metaphor of this idea of how sex and porn are often talked about in the Christian culture. And then we read Every Man's Battle. It's like, oh, I was not unique in that thought, but they think it's a benefit. And I think the issue with pornography is that it's such a rampant issue in so many marriages, but women are already hurt by this. And then our books come along and tell them, if you had put out once more a week, maybe he wouldn't be struggling.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Like Focus on the Family literally said in one of their programs, just as we were writing the book, that, maybe the reason so many men get into porn is because their wives aren't having enough sex. Sheet Music opens with a story of Mark and Brenda, where Brenda's really busy with the small children and she's exhausted. And so he turns to porn and masturbation. And Lehman then says what Brenda failed to realize is how much the sexual winter is costing her marriage. But he never says what Mark failed to realize is him pouting about not getting enough sex instead of getting involved with the children.
Right.
Maybe giving his wife a break for once.
But,
Right.
But this idea that porn use is caused by the wife is so wrong when you realize that for the vast majority of people, and maybe Joanna can speak to this, porn use predated the marriage.
Right.
Absolutely. Especially with younger men. We found that was the case. If they're under 40, and which makes complete sense, that porn became much more readily available with the onset of the internet pornography movement. Guys that are growing up now and getting married and presumably buying these books now are very, very likely to have had a porn problem, starting in their teens or even younger. And so for treating it as if it's this new thing in their lives that it's being caused by their wife not having enough sex, I mean, it's just really quite out of touch, quite frankly. And we also found that when men believe the all men lust idea, they may actually not have any. They may think that they're having this huge struggle with lust, but then they don't give us any evidence that they are. So I think it's actually very, very hard on men because they're experiencing all of this shame, perhaps unnecessarily because they just find a woman attractive and they think that that's lust. I think that we need to remember that these messages are not ideal for either spouse. They're causing shame for both partners. And that shame can put a wedge between the two of them. And what we're hoping for is that by centering women's experiences in this book, that will actually create an opportunity for more intimacy for both partners.
Right. Yeah. And society supports what we're being told by these books. I mean, every time we turn around, we're being told that it's all about men getting pleasure and women serving men. I mean, you pointed out in your book that one of the basis of sex trafficking is pornography. Right.
Yeah, it's a huge factor. And that's the thing. We often think that, well, porn doesn't hurt anyone. He's just using it, because he's stressed and it helps him not take anything out on his wife. It's like, well, porn, besides the betrayal trauma to his wife, besides the fact that it can make him a more selfish person and cause a lot of woundedness and shame, et cetera, those are also real people in pornography, and the majority of them are being hurt in some way. Plus, the acts that are done in porn are then used against people in sexual abuse situations, because when people are often sexually abused because people want to act out what they've seen in porn. So the more extreme porn gets, then the more that is going to be used to hurt real life people too.
And I will say that in our focus groups, and these are stories that we were trying to figure out how to put in the book, but we just couldn't. We did talk to at least one woman who the whole "you need to have sex with your husband, won't watch porn" message was quite damaging because she was being asked to act out things that he had seen in pornography and dress up like different women in pornography. And this is why we need to recognize, as an evangelical culture, as a Christian culture, that you can't replace porn with sex because they are fundamentally opposing forces.
Yeah.
Pornography and healthy sexuality are not substitutes for each other. If you're not having enough sex, the craving is not filled by pornography, and you can't fill the pornographic craving with having loving, consensual, mutual, humanizing sex with your married partner. They are two different things. And when books say, do the right thing, give him release when he's cutting himself off from porn, like they do in Every Man's Battle, what they are saying is, in essence, sex and porn are the same drive.
Right. And they're different. They're different pathways entirely in the brain.
And we need to see them as not only different, but opposing, right? You might be doing the same actions in some cases, although I will also say, in many times you are not. There are many actions you do in pornography that are not ever appropriate. But although you might be having sex, pornographic sex and humanizing sex are two different things. And if the kind of sex you are having is curing a pornographic craving, it is likely not humanizing, respectful, or dignified for your partner.
Good point. Good point. You know, we know that sin is progressive, right? I mean, it always, as a therapist, I used to work with sex offenders. Every single one of them started out looking at pornography. None of them, as children, said, when I grow up, I want to be a pedophile.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's progressive. Sin is progressive. You look at this, it doesn't satisfy anymore. You look at this, you do this, you do this. It's progressive, you know. One of the important topics that you guys cover in the book is about how sex is in the marital bed, and God designed the marital bed. Can you talk about how God intended sex? You made some points about what sex is supposed to look like.
Yes. Okay. We can actually just tell you what they are, because we have some principles about what sex is supposed to look like.
Because the truth is, we don't know that, right? I mean, it's not natural to know what that looks like.
Yeah, exactly. So we came up after looking at all of our data, reviewing these books, and thinking about what a better way forward would look like based on our survey data. We came up with some principles for healthy sexuality that is biblical, in that it is humanizing, dignifying, and respectful of both people, right?
Amen.
So here's one of them. Sex should be personal. It's a personal experience. You aren't just using someone. It's a true knowing. Sex should be pleasurable. It was designed to feel good for both people. You know, one person's pleasure is not a bonus.
Right.
Sex should be pure, which means that both partners can expect the other to take responsibility to keep themselves free of sexual sin. Other words, it's not how Kevin Lehman says in sheet music, faithfulness is not a two-way street. We are each responsible for our own actions.
That's a big one, because all these books are talking about how it's your job to keep your husband pure.
Exactly. Yep. We do say also sex should be prioritized, which is that, you know, we do expect that both partners in a relationship should desire sex. And so if one is not desiring sex, that's not just a given. We should address that. Right. Sex should be pressure-free, and this is a big one. We say sex is a gift freely given. It is not about getting what you want through manipulation, coercion, or threat. As well, sex should put the other first. It's about considering your spouse's wants and needs before you consider your own, which is fundamentally different than what I will say men are told in many of these books. Again, let's just keep coming back to the fact that Kevin Lehman literally told postpartum women that they have to take care of their husbands. How on earth is that putting the wife's needs in even a realm in the same realm as the husband's? So.
And let's talk about what is it? 1 Corinthians 7.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Let's say the last one.
Yeah, sorry, we'll say the last one. The last one is that sex should be passionate.
Yes.
Right? Sex is not just a begrudging duty. It's not something that's ho-hum. It's something that is beautiful and ecstatic and allows you to experience freedom and in a way that is just supremely vulnerable, that nothing else really.
And obviously God designed this to be with one person.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, just like a beautiful thing between two people, not shared with multiple people.
Yep.
You know, one of the things you talked about, I think is really important, is libido, the two different kinds of libido. Will you touch on that?
Yeah. So first of all, it's assumed in almost all of our books, not all, I do need to say that there were some books that we read of our bestsellers that were really good, like Gift of Sex by the Penners. And I do want to give some recognition to them, because we're making it sound like all of the bestsellers were terrible, and they weren't. Like Gift of Sex by the Penners is a really excellent book. Boundaries in Marriage, Sacred Marriage, Intimate Issues. Like those books handled sex well and scored really well in a rubric. There were just a lot of other ones that really didn't. And, you know, in terms of libido, I would say that the rest of the books could be summarized by, again, Emerson Eggerichs in Love and Respect, when he said, if your husband is typical, he has a need that you don't have.
Yep.
Right. And so sex is something that men want and women don't. And that's how we see it. Men want it, women don't. Men have libido, women don't. But that's not what we found. Joanna, I know you have to step away in a minute, but do you want to just give us the stats before you step away?
Yes, actually, one of my favorite stats in the whole book. I tell people every graph is my favorite graph, just like all of my babies are my favorite baby. But let me find it. Sorry, 1 second. Come on, where are those pie graphs? I think my favorite though is here it is. When we look at libido, we actually find that the teachings that were internalized actually affect libido. So if a woman believes that lust is every man's battle, she says that 62% of the time, she says that her husband has the higher libido. But if she doesn't believe that lust is every man's battle, it's only 52%. That's a lot more couples where they're saying, actually our libidos are about the same, or where they say, actually I have the higher libido. And I think when we see libido as something that's coming in from so many different things, I actually had a lot of trouble running the stats libido, because so frequently I would find that it was I measuring libido, or was I measuring marital satisfaction? Was I measuring libido, or was I measuring whether or not she gets aroused? Was I measuring libido, or was I measuring the fact that she never orgasms? And I think that we need to kind of take a step back from like, how frequently does she want sex, to, is sex good for her? Is she having a pleasant experience? Does she feel seen? And again, as we were talking about, are things like periods, the postpartum period, hormonal changes, are those being taken into consideration in their marriage? And are both of them being sacrificial? Frankly, a lot of the times we found that husbands aren't being sacrificial. So the ask that we're making tends to be toward husbands. But those questions are so important to be asking as we're thinking about how libido is manifesting.
The way that we started phrasing it, me and Joanna, we were going through all the stats, was libido in essence needs to be the canary in the coal mine, right? Instead of just assuming she doesn't have a libido, we should start saying, like, if she doesn't have a libido, why? Like, I'm sorry, if we're gonna, a lot of these books that were really harmful, and this is my kind of snarky beef, is that they're all very focused on God's gender roles, right? Like men are visually stimulated and women aren't. Men have a libido and women don't. This is how God made us. Well, God gave women a clitoris, which has no purpose other than pleasure. Additionally, God designed women to be able to have multiple orgasms successively for every one orgasm their husband has. So if we're going to talk about God-given gender roles, why on earth is multiple orgasms in the clitoris never part of the conversation? Right? Are we actually caring about how God made men and women different? Or are we just trying to push an agenda? Because I think if we actually cared about how God made us, we'd talk a little bit more about women's sexual pleasure instead of just saying they don't have a libido. Because everything, when you look at how we are designed as women, when you look at our study that we did of 20,000 women who have really good sex tend not to stop having it. You know, women who orgasm, women who feel close to their husbands, women who get aroused frequently, they like sex, they look forward to sex, and they keep having sex. It is not rocket science.
And you asked about the different kinds of libido. This is an interesting one too. I think that often we see libido in male terms. And what I mean by that is that a lot of men have what we would call a spontaneous libido. So they feel this physical need for sex right away. A lot of women have that too. Okay. So it isn't like it's only men. And that's why I don't like talking in terms of men and women's libido. I think it's more important to talk in terms of how your libido shows itself. So the way that I always put it is like this. When you're watching a movie or a TV show, the plot when it comes to sex always looks something like this. The couple is together and they start to pant. And so they kiss and they take off their clothes and they end up in bed. And that's what we think libido looks like, right? Pant, kiss, take off your clothes, end up in bed. So pant, kiss, close, bed. We figure that's libido. And so then if you're at home and you're waiting to pant and nothing's happening, you figure that you just don't have libido. But for a lot of people, the panting doesn't come first. For a lot of people, if you start to kiss, and if you start to touch, then the panting is going to come. And so for some people, it might be pant, kiss, close, bed. For other people, it might be bed, kiss, close, pant. Like it doesn't matter. And we would call that more responsive libido. But one of the things that we found is that it didn't matter whether women were aroused before they started to make love, as long as they had confidence that they were going to get aroused once they did start, they were pretty much as equally likely to enjoy it and become aroused and have an orgasm. The problem is not whether you're aroused first or not. The problem is, do you have faith that it's actually going to feel good once you start?
Right. And if you think your husband's in it for 3 minutes,
yeah,
you're not going to allow yourself to go there. Right?
Exactly. And so we need to stop focusing on libido and start focusing on making sure that it feels good for her, because no one ever talks about the orgasm gap.
No.
And I think we need to talk about the orgasm gap loudly and often.
Talk about the orgasm gap.
Yeah. So basically, and it's hard to get an exact number, but it's somewhere between 43 and 47 points. And what we mean by that is that, let's say that 95 to 96% of men always or almost always orgasm during a sexual encounter. But for women, it's only about 48 or 49%. And so that's you're looking at like a 45-point orgasm gap at least.
That's huge.
Right? And like if we're seeing the whole problem with sex and marriage as being women don't have sex enough, which is what the majority of these books are about. Right. Women, you need to have more sex. You're obligated to give him sex. Do not deprive him of sex.
Right.
Well, forget the do not deprive thing. She's already being deprived.
Right.
In more than half of marriages, she's already being deprived because she can't reliably expect to orgasm. And if she can't expect to orgasm, then she's the one who's being deprived, not him.
Right. Oh, wow. Yeah. Hello. Right. Exactly. So what do we say to men? What's the message to men here? What would you say to men who might be listening to this interview?
Well, what we like to say is that the expectation needs to be that, men should not be satisfied with a sexual encounter unless his wife is also satisfied. Like his goal should be her pleasure. That's what a sacrificially loving husband who wants to have a good sex life should aim for. It's not enough just to try to get the right number of sexual encounters. It's about focusing on your wife's experience. And that might mean having to go a little bit slower or even back up.
Right.
A lot of couples, they start off their married relationship with the wedding night, and that's their first experience having sex, and it's rushed, and they're not aroused, and they're exhausted, and then they wonder why sex doesn't feel good for their wife afterwards. And so if we start to tell men that your wife was created to experience sexual pleasure at the same level that you are. They are just as sexual as men are, women are. And if that's the expectation, frankly, I think a lot of it will sort itself out. We've just got really messed up expectations.
And that was really interesting. One of the women in your book talked about that, is that her expectation for marriage was that they would have sex this many times during the week, and then her husband, was like, no, and their libidos she thought were off, and it is your disappointment is equal to your expectation, right? And so if you're thinking, okay, I'm a virgin, and on my wedding night after I get married, we're going to have sex 3-4 times a week, and that doesn't happen, you think something's wrong.
Yeah. And if the goal is really about the quality of sexual experience, frankly, the frequency does tend to sort itself out.
Yeah.
We did look at that, and we're going to be honest here. Let's pull the curtain right back. Women who believe these damaging teachings, women who believe that they have to have sex, their husbands will watch porn, they have to have sex whenever their husbands want it, and they're obligated, they shouldn't say no. Women who believe all these harmful teachings, they have sex more.
Mhm.
They have sex more often.
Mhm.
They also orgasm less, and they have more sexual pain.
Yeah.
It is bad sex.
Hmm.
Yeah.
But we're not saying that women who have good sex only have sex once every 6 months.
Mhm.
It's a very minor difference. It is not like you're going from having sex 4 times a week to once every fortnight.
Yeah.
You know, we're talking like maybe 1 or 2 times a week difference.
Mhm.
From the most extreme to kind of the normal from those who have a healthy sex life. And if our sex and marriage advice becomes less centered on making sure that women are giving as much as they physically can, even on their period and in their postpartum period, to make sure that the husbands are so sexually satiated that they don't even feel the temptation to pornography or other women anymore, instead of having the goal be sexual numbness, if we instead focus on sexual fulfillment and life-giving sex, that happens maybe less often, but it's actually intimate.
Mhm.
I think the transformation that we'll see in marriages will just be so healing to so many.
Absolutely.
Because I'm sorry, what guy wants sexual numbness over sexual ecstatic joy from his wife?
Mhm.
You know, like,
Right.
but that's what these books are promoting.
Right.
It makes no sense.
And I do believe your book just has the potential to heal marriages. And this book I highly recommend for anybody to buy. Our listeners, I was telling the authors earlier, for those of you who are listening, that I probably have bought 20 copies already and handed them out. We are giving away 5 copies of this book. For those of you who are listening, all you have to do is hit the subscribe button, or you can also go to authorlesliemontgomery.com. There's a copy of it right there, The Great Sex Rescue. I will have a link to the ladies' website, how to get a hold of them, and how to get a hold of Sheila, and her website as well, and her blog. This is the first of 2 interviews. We are going to be meeting with Miss Rebecca again for another 45 to 50-minute interview. So this is part 1 of 2. Thank you guys for being with us today. Thank Joanna, who's not with us. She left, but please thank her for us. But you guys are great. I'm just so blessed. Highly recommend the book. The book is The Great Sex Rescue. Believe me, it will set you free, and you'll want to buy other copies to hand out to everybody. I think it's a book every young woman needs to read, maybe even every young couple needs to read before they're married. I think it would really help prepare them for marriage, for sure.
Wow,
Thank
those are
you.
great. Those are strong words, Leslie. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I can't over recommend it. But thank you so much for being with us, and Lord bless you. And Rebecca, you'll be back with us.
Looking forward to it.
All right.
Awesome.